Toronto Pearson now handles more international passengers than every airport in North America except one. JFK, not Atlanta, not O'Hare, not LAX. It does this using a rule most flyers have never heard of. You can clear United States Customs before you ever leave Canada, then step off the plane in America already counted as a domestic arrival. Pearson still trails the American giants on total passenger count, 47 million a year against Atlanta's 108 million. But on the number that defines a global gateway, international traffic, it has climbed past nearly every hub on the continent. A 1952 customs deal, one airline's fortress strategy, and a decade of demand no American carrier wanted to serve turned an airport most U.S. travelers can't place on a map into the second most important international gateway in North America. Here's the mechanism behind it. The customs rule is called pre-clearance, and Toronto Pearson was the first airport in the world to get it, back in 1952. Under normal international travel, the sequence runs the same everywhere. You land, then you queue for the host country's own customs and immigration counters, badges, questions, the works. On the far side of a border you have already physically crossed. Pre-clearance flips the order entirely. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers work inside a dedicated hall built directly into Pearson on Canadian soil. So you clear American immigration and customs before you ever board. You land at your U.S. destination already processed as a domestic arrival. Walking straight past the international corridor, everyone else on your flight from anywhere else in the world has to stand in. On paper, that's a small procedural change. In an airline's scheduling department, it reshapes an entire spreadsheet. Every other international flight into the United States forces the destination airport to hold a customs officer, a queue, and a gate close to the international arrivals hall. A pre-cleared flight from Pearson needs none of that. It can land at a small regional gate at a hub that's already jammed with domestic traffic without adding a single minute to anyone's connection. Airlines can schedule a Pearson to US route on the same grid as a purely domestic hop, slot it into whichever gate happens to be free that hour, and staff it like any other short flight. That flexibility makes the route cheaper to run and easier to sell, a cost advantage buried in the scheduling grid that no press release ever announces. Yet it shows up in every timetable an airline builds around Pearson. The arrangement reportedly began at American Airlines' request, a way to speed its own Canada to US traffic through crowded terminals back in the early 1950s. Whatever the exact origin, the effect has compounded every year since. One of the most liked comments under a competitor's video on this exact airport calls the reverse trip, landing in Canada and clearing into the US system before you have even left, skipping the line into the gulag. It's a joke, obviously, but it's pointing at something real. For a huge share of this audience, that customs hall is the single most memorable thing about flying through Pearson, ahead of any traffic statistic a report could publish. Pearson isn't the only Canadian airport with the privilege either. Montreal has pre-clearance too, and it's chasing its own expansion into Europe. But Montreal hasn't built the connecting network required to turn a customs rule into a hub strategy. Toronto has, and that gap is what this video is about. The rule was sitting there for more than one airport to use. Only one of them built an entire business on top of it, and everything that follows in this video is the story of how. It also solved a much older headache for a huge chunk of North American travelers. Before pre-clearance existed anywhere on the continent, a delayed international flight could mean landing in the US with barely enough time to fight through a customs line before a connection closed, and missing that connection meant an airline hotel voucher and a very long night in a terminal. Pearson passengers doing the same US connection have effectively been skipping that entire failure mode since 1952. It's the kind of advantage that never shows up in a press release, because nobody writes a headline about the disaster that didn't happen. Here's what that strategy produced, in the numbers that matter. In 2024, Toronto Pearson handled roughly 30.4 million international passengers. JFK, the only North American airport that beat it, handled around 35 million. Every other giant on the continent, Atlanta, O'Hare, LAX, Miami, moved more people overall, but fewer of them internationally. That's the paradox worth sitting with. Atlanta handled roughly 108 million total passengers in the same period, more than double Pearson's 47 million. By the blunt, biggest airport measure, the one that shows up in every headline about the world's busiest hub, Atlanta wins easily, and it isn't close. But raw passenger count was never the number that defines a global gateway. Most of Atlanta's volume is domestic connecting traffic, passengers changing planes between two US cities who never touch a customs desk at all, and that kind of traffic is comparatively cheap for an airport to handle. No border officers, no currency counters, no foreign carrier agreements to negotiate. The number that measures how important an airport is to the rest of the world is how many passengers are crossing an international border through it, because that traffic is the costly kind to serve, and it's also the kind every government and every foreign airline pays closest attention to. On that one number, the number airlines and diplomats care about, Pearson has climbed past nearly every American hub except the one at the very top. Think about what that means for a city that most Americans still associate with hockey and maple syrup jokes before they associate it with aviation. An airport most US travelers have never had a reason to think about now negotiates with foreign governments, wins over reluctant airlines, and outranks airports 3 times its total size on the one number that decides whether an airline builds a route through you or around you. A regional planner in Atlanta or Chicago doesn't lose sleep over a Canadian airport being bigger. They lose sleep over one being more important to the routes that pay. If a video like this is useful to you, an under-the-radar airport earning its ranking with real numbers instead of a marketing headline, hitting subscribe costs nothing, and it's the reason more of these get made. And if the Atlanta versus Pearson gap surprised you the way it surprised us pulling the numbers, send this to the one friend who insists Atlanta is simply the busiest airport in the world, and let them argue with the international column specifically. None of this happens without one airline. Air Canada controls roughly half of all seats at Pearson, and in aviation, that kind of concentration has a name: a fortress hub, an airport one airline controls so completely that rivals can't realistically compete for the same routes out of it. Fortress hubs usually mean higher fares and thinner competition on the routes an airline already owns, which is why regulators tend to watch them warily, and why a traveler comparing prices out of Pearson against prices out of a more contested airport will often find Pearson's the pricier ticket. What makes Pearson's version worth studying is what Air Canada chose to do with that control. Instead of just defending its existing domestic routes and calling it a strategy, it used that dominance to push outward, chasing long-haul international demand that had nowhere else in Canada to go. Much of that demand is diaspora traffic, immigrants and their extended families flying home to visit relatives, attend weddings, or bring parents over for months at a time. Toronto has one of the largest and most diverse foreign-born populations of any city in North America, and an airline sitting on top of that customer base has an obvious incentive to keep adding long-haul routes to Mumbai, Manila, or Sao Paulo rather than fight yet another domestic carrier for one more seat between Toronto and Ottawa. Air Canada took that incentive seriously for well over a decade, route by route, market by market, long before anyone was writing headlines about Toronto's ranking. Pearson's international numbers are the accumulated result of that single strategic choice, repeated dozens of times over, year after year, until the totals caught up with the strategy behind them. And in the last 2 years, that strategy produced the moment that should have been the headline on every aviation outlet, and mostly was not. In June 2025, Etihad Airways started flying an Airbus A380, the largest passenger jet ever built, 486 seats, 4 cabin classes including a private suite Etihad calls the Residence, complete with its own shower, daily between Abu Dhabi and Toronto. Airlines typically reserve their A380s for the small handful of cities that can reliably fill nearly 500 seats a day, marquee names like London or Sydney that need no introduction on an airline's route map. Toronto made that list. JFK, at the moment Eddie had made the call, did not get the daily A380. New York's biggest gateway lost out to a Canadian airport most American travelers still could not find on a map, and Eddie had made that call with its own money, based on nothing but which airport it expected to fill that aircraft every single day of the year. A year later, Air Canada resumed non-stop service between Toronto and Shanghai, its first direct flight to mainland China from this particular airport since the route went dark in January 2020. That last qualifier matters. Air Canada never fully abandoned China service across its whole network. It kept flying out of Vancouver through the gap. But the Toronto to Shanghai route sat empty for more than 5 years through a pandemic and a slow, uneven recovery in trans-Pacific travel, and its return in June 2026 tells you Air Canada now sees enough standalone demand through Pearson on its own to justify one of the longest, most expensive routes any airline can operate. Line those two decisions up next to each other. An A380 rerouted away from JFK, and a China route that had been dark for 5 years reopened through Toronto instead. That is not a rounding error buried in a spreadsheet somewhere. That is two of the airline industry's most selective, most risk-averse decision makers independently within the same 18-month window, concluding the same thing about the same mid-sized Canadian airport, with hundreds of millions of dollars of aircraft riding on being right. Pearson's own operator is betting the next decade on that same conclusion. In May 2026, the Greater Toronto Airports Authority broke ground on Pearson LIFT, a $3 billion Canadian dollars first phase of a much larger multi-year rebuild aimed at pushing annual capacity from 47 million passengers to 65 million by the early 2030s, a jump of roughly 35% above where the airport sits today. The plan adds new terminal space and new gates built for wide-body international aircraft, infrastructure designed around exactly the kind of long-haul route Etihad and Air Canada just proved out. This is not routine maintenance spending on aging terminals. It is an airport operator wagering 3 billion Canadian dollars in concrete and steel poured over the next several years. That the international growth of the last few years is a durable trend and not a temporary spike. And building the physical capacity now to keep chasing that trend before a rival airport on either side of the border gets there first. A bet that size only makes sense if the people making it believe the A380 and the Shanghai route were not one-off wins, but the new baseline, and every extra wide-body gate poured into that expansion is a wager against the very airports still fighting each other over the ones they already have. Which raises the question everyone watching this should be asking. If the demand behind all of this is real, why haven't Atlanta, JFK, or O'Hare just outbuilt Pearson and taken the international traffic back for themselves? The honest answer is that most of them structurally can't, and the reasons are almost entirely regulatory, not competitive. Start with O'Hare. The FAA capped the airport at 2,708 flights a day in 2026. That cap has since been extended for another year, and it is a hard ceiling that has nothing to do with how much international demand Chicago could theoretically serve. It is entirely about how much runway and airspace capacity physically exists around the airport. JFK carries a version of the same problem in slower motion. Its takeoff and landing slots, reserved time windows rationed like real estate because they're simply aren't enough of them for every airline that wants one, are close to fully allocated. That's exactly why an airline looking to add a new daily wide-body route often finds it easier to schedule that flight into Toronto than to fight for one more slot at JFK. Detroit carries its own version of the limitation. One airline effectively runs the entire hub, which caps how aggressively that airport can chase new international routes without cannibalizing its own existing network. Layer one more factor on top of the regulatory ceiling. Reported figures suggest Canadian trips to the United States fell more than 25% through 2025, and Air Canada apparently cut close to 8% of its US-bound transborder capacity, redeploying those same aircraft toward Europe, Asia, and Latin America instead. Exactly how much of that shift is simple pricing? How much is the broader political friction between the two countries this year, and how much is Air Canada just noticing better margins overseas is disputed, and the aviation analysts who cover this story do not agree with each other on the split. What do you think is driving that redeployment? Cost, politics, or something this video hasn't even mentioned? Put your read in the comments because we'd like to see where this audience lands on it, and the disagreement in the replies is usually more interesting than the headline. None of that makes Pearson simply the winner across every category, and the airport still lags well behind its new international ranking in more than one place. Passenger satisfaction surveys have repeatedly ranked Pearson near the bottom among major North American hubs, well behind smaller airports that barely register on the international rankings and don't move a fraction of Pearson's total traffic. Ask anyone who's connected through a packed Pearson terminal at rush hour, standing in a security line that doubles back on itself twice, and the international ranking in this video will not be the first thing they mention. Growth also slowed sharply this past year, up only around 1% after several stronger years in a row. Total passenger volume still has not fully climbed back above its peak from before the pandemic. A reminder that even a real long-term winner does not move in a straight line every single year. A $3 billion rebuild is a bet on where the next decade goes, not a guarantee that every year between now and then looks the same as the last one. Even the wider region backing all of this growth comes with its own footnote. Through 2024, the Toronto metro area was, by the numbers, the fastest growing metro in North America, ahead of every American city on the same list. In 2025, it lost that title, as rising housing costs pushed people out of the region faster than new arrivals could replace them. A recent forecast expects the Toronto-Waterloo corridor to reclaim the fastest growing crown eventually. That return is pegged nearly a decade out, which makes it a projection worth watching later, not a fact you can repeat about this year, and worth flagging here precisely because some reporting on this airport still gets it wrong. Set the caveats above beside the numbers that don't need any softening at all, and the story still holds. Pearson beat the largest airports on the continent at the one thing a global gateway is judged on, using a customs rule from 1952, an airline willing to bet on immigrants and long-haul routes instead of another domestic turf war, and a set of American rivals boxed in by their own runways and their own rationed slots. JFK still wins outright and probably will for a long time yet. Everyone else on this list is now chasing Toronto instead of the other way around. And Pearson's own $3 billion bet says it intends to keep things that way for a long time to come. Somewhere in a scheduling office in Abu Dhabi or an expansion committee in Chicago, someone is looking at these same numbers right now and asking how a mid-sized Canadian airport got here first, and whether the answer changes anything about where they send their next widebody order. For Pearson, the answer already changed course: gates, and a $3 billion construction budget, and it changed them years before most of its rivals noticed the shift was happening at all. If you want the next one of these the moment it lands, subscribe is still sitting right there below this video. And if you've got a Pearson layover story of your own, good, bad, or somewhere in the customs hall in between, the comments section below is exactly where it belongs.